It's Ash from Super Videos, back for another video for Season 10 of The Walking Dead. This is my things you may have missed and Easter eggs for Season 10 episode 14, which was called Look at the Flowers. You know the drill. If you haven't checked out my Easter egg videos for the previous episodes for the second half of Season 10, click the link that's going to drop on the top right to go check those out. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. So the first callback is actually something that happened during the opening minutes. So of course we have this scene here where we have Carol putting Alpha's head on a spike, which was obviously a callback to the border spike scene from Season 9 episode 15, which was called The Calm Before. Now, for those of you that missed it, this was actually not the same border. It was actually a different border. The original border was near a slanted hill, and there weren't any trees or anything like that near the border. But it was still a great callback to that moment, and not only was it a callback, but also it worked into the story, because with what Carol did, putting the head on the spike, she basically sent back the Whisperers a very clear message. If you continue your aggression towards us, we will put the head of every one of your members on a spike, just like you did with our members. And we're gonna start with your leader. Now, in the comics, they didn't do that. It was a missed opportunity, and I'm glad that they actually went that route and they worked that into the story and they circled it back around in the TV show. The next thing I think was a callback, but I'm not sure. If you take a look at the scenes between Negan and Carol, when they're at the border, we can see like a shed in the background. Now, I'm not sure if this was the same shed that Negan ended up killing Alpha at, or it was a different one. It looks like it's a different one, but I don't know if that was like a production mistake and whether it was supposed to be the same or it wasn't supposed to be the same. It doesn't look like it was supposed to be the same because the shed that Alpha died at was actually in the middle of the woods, but this one was near the edge of the woods. But regardless of whether it was the same exact one, I thought that was a pretty cool Easter egg because it connects to where Alpha actually died. The next Easter egg is actually a comic Easter egg. So this scene right here, right after Ezekiel loses his horse, we have Yumiko and Ezekiel on a horse together, Eugene on a separate horse. That, I think, is a callback or maybe a clue or an Easter egg, if you will, of something that happened in issue 165 of the Walking Dead's comic book series, which was called Opportunity. In that issue, there is a moment where we have Andrea, who's alive at this point, showing up and rescuing Eugene from a herd of walkers that are surrounding them. They are riding a horse and they do end up getting out of Dodge, but other things happen after that, which I'm not going to get into. But for comic readers, we kind of initially even thought that this was a clue that we might see that scene in that episode, but obviously we didn't. But I think it's a clue, and what's more interesting is that the conclusion of that moment happens a few issues after that in an issue called A Certain Doom. And what's interesting is that the finale is called A Certain Doom. So maybe this was in fact a clue that we're gonna see that soon. So we might actually see a moment close to that moment in the finale of this season. Regardless of whether it does happen in that episode or not, I think that it's definitely a cool Easter egg for comic readers. The next Easter egg I want to talk about is also something that connects to the comics. There is this specific scene where Eugene is talking to Yumiko and Ezekiel. He says, "My parents and I lived near rail tracks, and these rail tracks reminds me of that." Now, what's interesting is that that could be an Easter egg or a clue about a certain story we're going to see from the comics that's going to happen after the Whisperers arc is over. That story relates to Stephanie, who's the girl that Eugene was communicating with, and it connects to the next big community that Eugene and the group are going to find, which is called Commonwealth. Speaking of rail tracks, another thing that I thought was cool is these rail tracks may actually be the exact same rail tracks that we had in Season 6, Episode 14, which was called Twice as Far, where Dwight and some saviors ambushed the survivors and killed Denise. If you remember, Dwight shot her in the eye. So these rail tracks may actually be the exact same ones. There's two ways this could go. Either they were filmed in the same exact spot, but in the story they're not supposed to be, or in the story even they're supposed to be in the exact same spot. But regardless, I thought that was a pretty cool callback as well. The next thing I want to mention is this scene where we have the survivors coming across these walkers who are chained and put in cages could be a reference to something that happens in the final issue of The Walking Dead comic book, issue 193, which was called The Farmhouse. There is a particular story which is actually a sort of critical story for the final issue, involves some characters keeping walkers in cages. So that could be a connection or a reference to that moment from the comics. The next thing I want to mention is this particular scene where we have Whispers kneeling to Negan as their new alpha could have been a remixed version or a callback to issue 168 of The Walking Dead's comic book, which was called The Road's End, where we had some of the ex-saviors kneeling to Negan and showing their loyalty to Negan, to which Negan obviously shuts them down and says that I'm no longer the leader of the saviors. Now, in the show, of course, they can't really do that anymore because the saviors are all dead. I think Alden may be the only savior alive at this point. They did do sort of different remixes of this in the first half of season 9 where we had other saviors around, but Negan wasn't at the center of that. He wasn't involved with that. So I think they may have actually remixed that story from the comics, but replaced saviors with Whispers. The next Easter egg or callback is this scene right here where we have Negan ordering Daryl to kneel in front of him. This was obviously a callback to the Negan clearing scene and to him ordering the survivors to kneel in front of him before he did his eeny, meeny, miny, mo in season 6, episode 16. So that was a pretty cool callback as well. Now, not only was this a callback, but Negan did this on purpose to get under Daryl's skin a little bit because it obviously does remind him of that moment. The next thing I want to mention is the double barrel shotgun Negan took from the Whisperer actually belonged to Alpha. This was actually Alpha's double barrel shotgun. So that was pretty cool. Now I don't know whether Negan left the double barrel shotgun there or he took it with him, but this was in fact Alpha's double barrel shotgun. Speaking of Alpha's double barrel shotgun, right after Negan shoots one of the Whisperers in the face with the shotgun, he goes to shoot another one, but the gun either malfunctions or he runs out of bullets. Now I thought that was a great callback or Easter egg to something that happened in the season 8 finale, the final episode of All Out War, where we had all of the weapons malfunctioning and the bullets exploding as soon as they were fired, which was obviously Eugene's doing. So I thought this was a great callback to that moment. Even if the double barrel shotgun just ran out of bullets and it didn't actually malfunction, I thought that it could still be looked at as a Easter egg or callback to that moment. The next Easter egg involves Alpha and Carol. So during this scene where we have Alpha in hallucinations showing up and talking to Carol, she reveals that Carol sent Maggie letters talking to her about the Whispers and Alpha. So that was pretty interesting, and it could actually work to their advantage if they want to have Maggie show up and still be a part of the Whispers arc. Although I think it's a better idea for Maggie to show up after the Whispers conflict, but if they end up bringing her in before that ends and having her be a part of it, I think the fact that they revealed that Carol sent her letters talking to her about Alpha and the Whispers could work to their advantage and could be very interesting because Maggie's already in the loop about what's going on. Now, speaking of Maggie, I will do a video separately talking about how I think Maggie's going to come back and what sort of story we're going to see from Maggie coming up. But just to keep this video short, all I can say is that Maggie's reintroduction into the story is most likely going to happen as a small scene at the end of the final episode, the finale. So I don't think that Maggie's actually going to be a part of the Whisperers arc. I don't think she's going to be a big part of the current story that we have. When we have Alpha telling Carol, look at the flowers, right before the walker gets to Carol, was actually a callback to what Carol told Lizzie. She said, look at the flowers before shooting her in the head and killing her. Remember that? So I thought that was a pretty cool and interesting callback to that moment. Now what obviously connects to that as well is the title of this episode because it was called Look at the Flowers. So that was a pretty cool callback and connection as well. The other thing I want to mention is when we have Yumiko, King Ezekiel, and Eugene showing up to the city, they see these walkers chained and decorations on these walkers. Now, this was actually done by none other than Juanita Sanchez, or Princess. She reveals that in the opening minutes of the upcoming episode, so this was actually her doing. So that was pretty cool. Next thing I want to mention is when Beta goes to this room where there's like musical instruments and there's actually tons of his own records, his own music in there. This may have actually been the exact same spot he used to stay at when everything went down, before he had to flee and go to the mental hospital that he was at, where he was found by Alpha and Lydia in the flashback episode. Now, there is a chance that this was just an area a fan of his used to stay at, but it's also possible that it was the area or the exact same room he used to stay at. Next thing I want to mention is when Beta finds this note that says, "These two eyes see one truth." I think that was actually a lyric from his own song, if I'm not mistaken. Speaking of Beta though, this big reveal about Beta's identity, he was a country singer before the apocalypse and his stage name was Half Moon, was a pretty awesome reveal. Now, there were actually tons and tons of clues before this big reveal. First of which came in Fear the Walking Dead in season 5 episode 14, which was called Today and Tomorrow. In that episode, we have like a bunch of record vinyls falling down to the ground. These actually belong to Daniel Salazar. He had these in his collection. Now, one of them was this album cover of someone who looked a lot like Beta. And we did a lot of videos talking about whether it was or wasn't. And at this point, we can obviously tell that it was in fact Beta. That album cover was Half Moon's album. The other came when we actually saw the flashback of Beta, because in that episode, there were a lot of moments where it hinted to us that Beta could have had a history in music in his previous life before the apocalypse. And even when Alpha took the mask off of Beta to look at his face, she actually cracked a smile as if she recognized him. The other clue came in a few episodes ago where one of the Whisperers recognized Beta when half of his mask was gone. The Whisperer even said, "I thought your voice was familiar." Now, the final clue was something that actually happened near the beginning of the season, in season 10 episode 5, which was called What It Always Is. In one of the scenes where we have Yumiko talking to Magna, there's actually music playing in the background. That music is actually Half Moon's music. That song is actually the exact same song that Beta actually plays in season 10 episode 14 when he's luring in all of the walkers. The last Easter egg is actually connected to Beta as well. After Gamma tore half of his original mask off, he stitched it back together, but after he found Alpha dead and decapitated and all of that, there's this scene at the end of this episode where he again rips half of his own mask off, and then we see this shot of him with the mask on. Half of his face is new or is fresh. So what he probably did is he skinned Alpha's face and he prepared a mask from her face and he put half of her face on his original mask, built a new mask for himself, which is pretty disturbing to think of. So that was the final thing I wanted to go through. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comment section below. That's it for this video. See you next time for another super video.